Exactly 80 years ago, my Polish grandfather played a key role in liberating this northern Italian city from the occupation of Nazi Germany. It was the final chapter for him as part of a long and treacherous odyssey that took him through halfway across the world, starting in his home region of Wołyń in eastern Poland. He was captured by the Russians along with his family and deported to Siberia to work in a gulag for a couple of years. He then made his way through central Russia right to the southern border of this monumental country. He then made his way through Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, through the Middle East, through Egypt, through Northern Africa, and then played a key role in a number of the seminal battles within the bloody Italian campaign at Imola and Monte Cassino. My grandfather was, of course, one of the circa 100,000 Polish Second Corps, led by the charismatic General Władysław Anders. Their story and its contribution to the Second World War is perhaps one of the most underrated and overshadowed components of Second World War and its history. On the anniversary of Victory in Europe Day this week, I've returned to the very location where his story ended in the context of the Second World War, to be under the same patch of sky in the same city, to recapture and document his final contribution to the Second World War. Welcome to Bologna. So I guess the big question you're asking is, how did my grandfather, a Polish civilian, end up in Italy of all places as part of such a significant campaign? Let me bring you up to speed. My grandfather passed away before I was born, and as I've grown up, I've always felt a quiet obligation to understand his life, to piece together his story. Over the years, that journey has taken me further than I ever expected. I recovered his unclaimed medals, unlocked access to his military records, found his grave, and even met people who knew him. With each discovery, my connection to him has grown, and so has my desire to honour his life, his legacy, and the extraordinary role he and his colleagues in the Polish Second Corps played in the war. In 2017, I travelled to the site of the Battle of Monte Cassino, and now, in spring 2025, on the week of the 80th anniversary of VE Day, I have returned to Italy, this time to retrace the route and to the battlefields of Bologna, where he spent the final weeks of the war 80 years on to the day. So I'm just in a train station many miles outside of Bologna, and there's this cracking mural of Europe on the wall, which I'm just going to use just to tell the story and just provide a little bit more kind of context around the Italian campaign. So just starting off with Poland. So historically, the country used to be a lot bigger than as is now. And where my grandfather came from, where my family originate from, is from the ancient province of Wołyń, in what was at the time eastern Poland. And so it's roughly around this area now. So the borders changed after the war, which I'll go into later on in the video. But in essence, it's now modern day Ukraine, but at the time was very much eastern Poland. Many of the troops from the Anders army actually came from these ancient provinces along the kind of eastern border. In terms of the Italian campaign, the Poles most likely took a ship from northern Africa, whether it was Tunisia or Algeria, and stopped at Malta, which was obviously British territory at the time. There had been many reasons for this: refueling, stocking up, etc., in advance of taking on the enemy when they landed in Italy. There would have been a checkpoint at Sicily, most likely. Again, this was under Allied control. And my grandfather and the troops arrived in Bari in 1943. Their first aspects of combat within the Italian campaign was playing a crucial role in Monte Cassino, the Battle of Monte Cassino, and defeating what was known as the Gustav Line, so the German defence unit within southern Italy. That liberated Rome, and the Gustav Line, the Germans, the Nazis, were in essence on the retreat at this point. 6 months later, he was involved in the Battle of Ancona on the kind of eastern coast of Italy. And then the final piece of the jigsaw in terms of his combat within Italy was the Battle of Bologna, but it actually started many miles outside of Bologna in a town called Faenza. they would have taken a ship from Ancona up to a portal town called Rimini. So it's not shown on this map, but it's basically just right outside of San Marino. Italian railway infrastructure at the time, as is now, was very advanced. Railways cover the kind of breadth of the country. So they would have taken a train journey to this checkpoint to begin the Battle of Bologna, which in essence took place or started on the 10th of April 1945. So I'm just outside the Faenza train station now. As I mentioned, this was where the Battle of Bologna began. The Polish troops would have more than likely arrived in Faenza via train. You know, I'm just speculating here, like, could briefings of the battle, the military operations, to my granddad and, you know, his many thousands of colleagues, could they have taken place in this kind of open area outside the station? Purely speculation, who knows, but you know, it's worth considering. In terms of the first checkpoint, the Senio River is roughly in this direction where I'm looking now. It's about 10 kilometers, so I'm just going to get a train to the next town to try and get a closer look at that river and just understand a little bit more about its challenges as a military checkpoint, a defense checkpoint by the Nazis. So well, let's head over there now. So I've just been trying to think, what must it have felt like for the Polish troops within this moment, these final stages of the Second World War, having gone what they would have gone through, seen what they would have seen in terms of the destruction of their villages, their towns, in many cases significant members of their families, driven by two evil forces, you know, let's put it bluntly, that wanted to obliterate Poland as a nation state. From a German perspective, the motives were very racial in nature. There was a lot of antagonism towards the Slavic population, towards the Polish population. They also wanted Poland from a resource perspective. It's a country very rich in resources. From a Russian perspective, the motives were entirely cultural and social. They wanted landowners. They had killed a lot of the Polish generals at the beginning of the war. Equally as well, they wanted kind of Poland's resources. Again, it goes without saying how rich those resources were in the context of a country. So having gone what they had gone through, had also, you know, in many cases performed an absolute miracle in terms of winning the Battle of Monte Cassino and the additional conflicts that they went through. It was around this time, right at the end of the Second World War, in which the Allies signed what was known as the Yalta Agreement, which would in essence reconfigure Poland's borders after the Second World War. As I mentioned, many of the corps came from the ancient Polish provinces on eastern Poland, and as a consequence of this agreement, they would be given over to Russia. So the destruction of all that history, the towns' names would change, the identity of those places would just change overnight. So it begs to differ, really. They would have easily thought, well, you know, what are we fighting for if there isn't a nation state at the end of this to go home to? Really interesting how they stayed motivated for this kind of final stage of the Second World War, and the resilience that they showed. So I'm just heading out of the town centre towards the Senio River now. I'm just trying to get a sense of what it would have been like in the spring of 1945. There's a lot of buildings around me. You know, it's very sort of typical Italian suburbia, but I can tell a lot of these buildings were built after the sort of Second World War. I did get a sense of the kind of context on the train journey. Some of the images that I'll show, you know, it's open fields, it's flatlands, vineyards, farms, very sort of little context. You know, there's very little sense that you'd be approaching Bologna. There's no landmarks, you can't see the skyline. But yeah, let's head down to the Senio River and see if we can understand a little bit more about the challenges to kind of overcome that military checkpoint. So just to show you where we're located, we're currently in a settlement many miles outside of Bologna called Castel Bolognese. Again, the significance of this location is the Senio River, which we're just about to head to shortly. We're on our way down there, which was the first major win for the Polish army against the Nazis within the Battle of Bologna. A lot has obviously changed within that time. We've got a historic town centre settlement, and the dwellings that I just showed you in the previous chapter of the video showed that a lot of the expansion of the town centre has taken place since the war, but its historic context would have been open fields, vineyards, farms, etc. And we're just on our way here now, and you can get a sense of what that context and that landscape would have looked like in 1945, other than these new houses and things and stuff. Very little has changed. So yeah, let's head down to the Senio River and get a further understanding of what it was like to overcome this military constraint. This is incredible. So I've made it to the Senio River. Before I made this trip, and whilst I was kind of planning it back home in England, I thought there'd be a number of challenges trying to get close to this river, just looking at the maps and the constraints and the restrictions, but obviously really proud to kind of see it in first person, and even more so really 80 years on, almost to the day, I'm in the very spot of where the Poles made that first significant breakthrough in the Battle of Bologna. What's more so as well, you can really get a sense of the challenges of overcoming this constraint as a defense unit. It's a very deep river, very easy to defend from a German perspective. Further on from a field as well, we've got the rolling hills in the background, but there's actually a gentle slope in the topography. So from further afield, you would have been able to see the Polish troops making their advancements as the Germans retreated, but had this significant defense unit within this river. What that would have done to the morale of the Polish troops, overcoming such a significant milestone only 24 hours into the battle, it's really inspiring when you see it within this context. So I just walked further up the riverbank, and this is really interesting. I just wanted to point this out. What on the face of it looks like a flood defense mechanism, I would argue, and I think there's every justification for this, that this could have been built as a defense mechanism by the Nazis to defend the river. Reason being, just looking at the age of the concrete, looking at the technique of this reinforced concrete as well, looking at the structure with this kind of step form, etc., you can easily imagine a soldier being able to kind of hide around the parapet of the concrete and shoot from above. Equally as well, when we look at this part of the river, it's very deep as well, so it's very easy to kind of defend against the advanced Polish troops. And again, as I mentioned, you could just see in the background as well, you've got this natural change in the topography, making it very visible to see advancing troops. So yeah, what a moment. I mean, really just kind of inspiring, and what a major obstacle to kind of overcome. So we've arrived by these public bikes, Ride Movi, which we don't have in the UK. You can't beat Europe. The cycling infrastructure is just brilliant, and I know things like this have been trialled in the UK. London has the Line bikes, etc. But it's a real shame that we just don't have that sort of same attitude towards cycling. But nonetheless, that's not why I'm here. We have, of course, arrived at the next checkpoint. And so we're at the next checkpoint, the Santerno River. So on the 12th and the 14th of April 1945, the Polish forces spent the best parts of 2 days trying to capture this checkpoint from the retreating Germans. I have tried to find as many reports as I can on this battle, and from what I understand, it was quite a bloody 48 hours. So I'm trying to kind of understand this again from the context of my grandfather, and again it's just purely sort of speculation here. So I've had it confirmed through the digitization of some of the archives of the Battle of Monte Cassino. His rank, or he was listed as a senior rifleman. There's kind of many aspects to that which have kind of got me thinking, you know. Clearly he was a gifted gunman, gifted with the use of the rifle, but it probably kind of stemmed from his background within rural Poland. He probably had a kind of upbringing of using guns quite often for hunting game and kind of other things. It was very much the kind of norm of his society as he was growing up. Again, it's, you know, quite it's a checkpoint that kind of works in the Germans' favour from my perspective. There's this really long kind of grass here. Obviously, I'm not sure if that was here in 1945. I've had to be kind of double careful. I know there's snakes and kind of all sorts in these locations, and I've got shorts on. And again, I'm just sort of speculating with what I see here. So this is a relatively new bridge. I can tell just by the brickwork and the construction. I am an architect by trade, that this bridge was built after the Second World War. Clearly it's been built after 1945. So I begin to wonder, was there an old bridge here that the Nazis potentially blew up as a consequence or an attempt to restrict the advancement of the Polish army, the Polish corps, en route to Bologna? Just looking at the terrain, again, as I keep emphasising, I'm no military expert, but the context, apart from the car parks and this utilities infrastructure and, you know, a couple of modern buildings, I imagine the terrain is largely unchanged from 1945. It's quite long grass, quite awkward to kind of walk through here. I was a bit nervous. I'm wearing shorts, so I know there's snakes and all sorts in this part of the world. But yeah, fascinating just to kind of see and trying to experience as much as I can just what was it like in situ, just to get a sense of the kind of context, the landscape, as part of this unbelievable journey towards Bologna. So we have another major military checkpoint overcome in terms of capturing the city of Imola from the Nazis. The Poles were then instructed to not take a rest, but to go on to Bologna. I've read, by all accounts, that normal military combat, in terms of timelines, a soldier is allowed to be on the force between 4 to 6 days. This was a very different context here. We're talking about the climax of the Second World War. The end was in sight. And given the amount of resources which were limited in terms of kind of soldier numbers, etc., the Poles were instructed to go on to Bologna. Given that the corps were such committed Catholics, unless they were Jewish, they had very little time to take stock of their achievements over the last week. And I'm just wondering, I'm just outside one of the Catholic churches in Imola. Could this have been a church where, within the limited time the soldiers had to take rest, to reflect on what had just happened over the last week, could this have been one of the churches where maybe they took time out just to pray to go on to the next battle? So I'm now in a settlement called Castel San Pietro. We're probably about 5-6 miles outside of Bologna at this point. It's a major thoroughfare into that southern eastern corner of Bologna, of which the Poles were advancing at this point in the final stages of the Second World War. There were a number of achievements that were made within this region, overcoming the obstacle of the Medici Canal, which was occupied by the Nazis as they retreated. And I've also read countless stories of just how exhausted the Polish Second Corps were at this point. And there's a number of interesting photographs that I've seen which kind of capture that exhaustion. Poles lying in the street after 2 weeks of really intense battle in the heat on the open plains as they advanced into Bologna. So the next stop is the Polish cemetery. We're probably about 5 kilometers outside of the city centre. Again, it's on that historic southern eastern route into the city that the Polish army took to unlock and liberate the city. So obviously a kind of key strategic site, right at the kind of the final stages of such a traumatic couple of weeks in kind of battle. The forces just must have been exhausted by this point. It's, you know, we're in a kind of flat open space, 5 kilometers away. I can't see the city skyline or anything like that, but obviously here to kind of pay my respects. From the research that I've done over the years, I'm absolutely certain, and I can probably say 100%, that there were no Romanowicz members of my family, other than my grandfather, who entered the Polish corps. What I've been told earlier as well is that the size of this cemetery, there's over 1,000 graves here, and that it's bigger than Monte Cassino, where obviously I mentioned that I've been before as well. I guess it just shows the kind of magnitude of war, and just kind of brings it all home, really, of how fortunate my grandfather was to, you know, survive such a difficult obstacle. So let's see what we can discover within the cemetery, and pay my respects to my grandfather's colleagues. Surely, you know, he must have known, you know, several tens, potentially hundreds of men who unfortunately lost their lives within the final chapter of the Second World War. So this is just in the entrance to the cemetery. There's various photographs, I guess, from Polish Second Corps collections, etc. The main man himself right in the middle, Vladislav Anders, General Vladislav Anders, who oversaw the Polish Second Corps. Some phenomenal imagery here. You know, I've seen some of these over the years. There's a lot on Google, many of these that I haven't. A lot of women as well. So one of the things that I want to point out was that as part of the formation of the Polish Corps, Polish Second Corps in Russia, a lot of females were accompanying them as part of that journey. Polish women who obviously performed a role within the war and the Italian campaign and the sort of liberating the city. And it's good to see that kind of captured here as well, and really sort of evident with this sort of photography. This is a really famous picture here. This is from Monte Cassino. Obviously Poland's, well, one of Poland's kind of golden hours, really, certainly of the Second World War, and certainly one of within their military history. You know, I've seen thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of these types of images online in various books. Never successfully seen one that includes my granddad. Maybe one day that yeah, you know, I might get lucky. But yeah, some phenomenal imagery once again, and just brings home the kind of magnitude of what these guys did. I mean, yeah, there's sort of chaps carrying a coffin there. The scale of the machinery in terms of the tanks, I mean, these are absolutely massive, and just the barbaric scenes and conditions that they lived in for many years in playing their part of defeating such an evil force. A very famous story at the top. This is Wojtek the bear. So and there's another kind of image there. So in northern Africa, the Polish army basically found this orphan bear, and they brought the bear into the camp, and eventually he was given his own sort of military status. He was given a ranking number, and they even changed the badge of that particular regiment to Wojtek. He almost became a kind of mascot in himself, and he did help out with the artillery in various different circumstances, carrying bombs and assisting in other means. And he survived all the way right to the end of the Second World War, and then retired and lived the remainder of his life in Edinburgh Zoo. And if anyone's ever in Scotland or from Edinburgh, there's a brilliant statue of Wojtek right outside the zoo. But yeah, just another phenomenal story as part of this campaign. Just in one of the sections of the cemetery now, and obviously quite moving to see these graves, looking at some of the dates as well. Jan Botorovic, losing his life in the end of March 1945, just weeks away from the Second World War finishing. What I want to stress as well is that a lot of these soldiers came from eastern Poland, so a similar part of the region to where my granddad and Romanewicz, my family name and my family historically come from. The ancient provinces on the eastern border, which has now moved and become the Ukraine. But yeah, really moving, and a lot of names that look, or that have an element of familiarity to them. Given my Polish heritage, Franciszek, that's my father's name, for example. There's this grave here. I can't see that surname, but that first name is Józef, which is the same name as my middle brother. Jan, which was my one of my uncle's names as well. But incredibly kind of moving stuff. Just the magnitude of what these men went through as part of the many forces within the Allies to give us the freedom that I guess we take for granted in many ways today. It's just really moving, just seeing it in this kind of context, particularly around the names as well. I mean, I've always felt that identity is very multifaceted. In one sense, I feel just as much Polish as I do English, and seeing these kind of everyday Polish names as well displayed in this kind of context really brings it home. I mean, Ludwig here, that's the name of my grandfather, and again there's a Stefan here, which is the name of my kind of youngest brother. It just really kind of brings it home, really, and the kind of magnitude of what these men went through, and how fortunate my grandfather was to survive such kind of turmoil against such a kind of evil force.
As you can unfortunately see from the quality of the footage, and I went up onto the roof. Here is the press van that is arriving in Liaguki at the It
was important for the people that work for that organization. So you're going to see a German officer that was doing the role.
Wow, what an experience that was. I'm just literally walking out. As I said at the beginning, the significance of this site is purely coincidental. It was just on the route of the Polish army as they advanced and the Nazis retreated on their way to liberating the city, which they did from the southern eastern corner. Historically, this site was basically a nursery for trees and sort of planting, etc. As you can see from the kind of vegetation, a lot of that's here. I keep wondering when I'm walking around this site, obviously we're walking to the kind of main artery of which the kind of Polish forces advance into the city. Am I walking on a spot where my granddad basically kind of passed through 80 years ago around this time in advancement of the city? they were great in there, really. I mean, coincidentally, I was shown around by the granddaughter of the journalist who documented the liberation, and like, what a massive coincidence that is, as a grandson of one of the soldiers who liberated their city, to be shown around via the granddaughter of the journalist who kind of documented it and really kind of captured its sort of significance through the medium of film and photography. We're just on the out now. Check this out. If that isn't a reminder of the significance of war, check the size of these bombs out that have been left over. Wow. Yeah, they look like Allied bombs. I'm obviously no military expert, so I can't, give any information on the sort of specification, but wow, if anything that needed a reminder of how lucky we are to live in 2025, incredible. Wow, you can just see the scale of these bombs. They're absolutely massive. I mean, I'm 6'5", 6'4". Wow, I don't know if anyone knows if those are American or British bombs by the specification. Yeah, that's incredible. But yeah, what a good couple of hours that was and stuff. They were really generous with the team in there. As I said, it's ran by the journalist's family, who kind of took all the photographs, did the filming, raised the profile, or kind of covered the story, if you like. And they've been really generous by giving me these amazing books that show the liberation of the city from the Polish side. So yeah, tremendously kind of generous in that sense, and much appreciated. What's kind of interesting as well, they had an element of kind of frustration. So with it being the 80th anniversary this year, just the lack of cooperation from certain kind of public bodies in terms of assisting them. What I mean by that, it kind of goes back to a point that I made at the beginning of the video, that certainly what the kind of Polish Second Corps did, and the Italian campaign in general, and not just what the Polish soldiers did. Obviously the kind of allies were a big part of that, but I've always felt, and it seems like others are as well, that campaign was always kind of overshadowed or kind of undervalued when you compare it to things like D-Day, Pearl Harbor, and kind of other instances that happened in the Second World War. That's not being derogatory or bringing them down by any stretch of the imagination, but I do believe the Italian campaign, and certainly the bravery and what the Polish corps did was just unbelievable. I'm just amazed it hasn't been made into a Hollywood film, or Netflix haven't got a hold of it as of yet. So I'm just about 2-3 kilometers max from the city centre now, and this is clearly a very significant location in the story of the Polish Second Corps and the Battle of Bologna. We're very much on the axes of the southern eastern entry point that the Poles made within the city as they advanced and the Germans retreated. Many years later, right on that artery, a park has been built in memory of the charismatic and great leader Władysław Anders. So Władysław Anders was the general of the Second Polish Corps. It's a really beautiful park and a really beautiful thing. I always just think there's an element of kind of nuance when someone has a park or a place of nature named after them, rather than a physical piece of infrastructure, be that a building or a street, for example. I accept it's kind of horses for courses, but there is something quite kind of monumental and kind of timeless about this place. It begs to differ. This very much would have been a key strategic war zone 80 years ago this week. While I'm kind of stood here, all the buildings that I've seen, it's quite a middle-class affluent neighbourhood. I have been quite impressed with it, to be honest, but the landscape 80 years ago would have been very different. Obviously none of these buildings would have been here. All the buildings that I can see have been constructed since the end of the Second World War, and you get the odd nook and cranny of kind of old building that I can see over there in the distance. I'm not sure if the camera's kind of picking that up, but very much part of that major thoroughfare of which my granddad and his colleagues within the Polish Second Corps made their advancement as the Nazis retreated to liberate the city of Bologna and play their part in the downfall of the Nazis and the Wehrmacht, and thus the end of the Second World War. Just trying to get a closer look at this sculpture, this monument to General Vladislav Anders. I can't really read too much into it. There's some obvious kind of iconography, but I was having this conversation with one of my brothers before I came out here. I mean, there's some phenomenal imagery and moving imagery of General Vladislav Anders, and you can just see with the way he walks, the way he presents himself, his stature, that he just oozes charisma. As I said earlier, for me, he's up there with one of the greatest generals, the greatest military generals the world has ever seen. Obviously there's an unconscious bias when I say that, but I think if anyone was to read into what this man did, how he captured the hope and spirit of a nation, and played his part in leading its way to saving it as a nation state. The reason Poland is a nation state is through what these men went through to kind of save its identity, and it was led by this very man, General Vladislav Anders. Obviously, when I talk about General Vladislav Anders, it's my opinion, it's my interpretation and opinion based on stuff that I've read and how I can articulate it. But I always think with these kind of characters, actions speak louder than words. So after the end of the Second World War, General Vladislav Anders, like all of the Polish Second Corps, they couldn't have gone back to their homeland of Poland because it was under Russian control, it was under communist control. They would have been persecuted, tortured, put in prison, arrested, etc., etc. So he lived the remainder of his life in London, but what he put in his will was something very specific. So when he died in 1970, he'd requested that he be buried back out in Italy, right at the site in the Polish cemetery at Monte Cassino, to be buried with the men who he served with as part of this monumental odyssey. And I think that just kind of speaks volumes about the guy and very much kind of backs a lot of the things that I've said up through the kind of actions that he undertook. So it's just started to rain quite heavy, so I just found some wine bar off the street, and I just want to make the point that both Copernicus and Anders, two of the greatest ever Polish people in history, both have quite a significant relationship to Bologna's history. Equally as well, I think if my granddad was alive, one of the questions that I would or the first question that I'd probably ask him is, did he ever meet Vladislav Anders? Obviously he must have seen him, obviously he must have kind of heard his speeches, his motivational speeches, his tactical speeches, but did he ever have a kind of one-on-one conversation with him, and what was he like? That I'd be really curious to know. I'm a few hundred meters away from the city entrance now, right at the end of the S9 highway, that southern eastern access point of which the Polish corps were attacking the city as the Nazis retreated. The Allies instructed them on the 21st of April 1945 to gain entry into the city and liberate Bologna, whereas the main Allies in the form of the British Army and the United States went onwards to the Lombardy Plains to continue fighting the retreating Germans. So I'm just trying to get a sense of the location and the kind of context and what that might have been like in 1945. Obviously this major piece of infrastructure wouldn't have been here in the form of the ring road. I am presuming that the old boundary to the city wall came right up to this entrance point. So this is very significant. So this is the exact point at which the Polish corps entered the city and liberated it from Nazi control, from Nazi occupation. Obviously a very proud moment for myself personally, knowing I'm in one of the exact spots of where my grandfather played such a key role as part of the Allied spring offensive to liberate this city, to defeat the Nazis, playing his role in the end of World War II. An extremely proud moment, and obviously quite a unique feeling knowing that 80 years on, I'm in the exact spot. I'm going to walk through that exact same entry point of which he did so proudly 80 years earlier. So let's head through. So walking through the exact point now of which the Polish corps entered the city to liberate it from Nazi control, and followed the route ahead where you can see what's known as the Street Maggiore. In the background there's a key Bologna landmark. That's what locals call the two towers, identifying the city centre and its exact point. I'm just going to zoom in here so you can get a better sense of that as well. Just while we're at this entry point, I want to just mention a couple of other things. So the liberation of Bologna, it was led by the Polish corps. The vast majority of soldiers playing their part in this liberation were Polish. However, it was supported by other Allied forces. There would have been British soldiers involved in this. There were American soldiers involved in this. Anzac, I'm pretty sure, were involved in this. Again, I'm no military expert, I'm no World War II expert. Surely someone can correct me in the comments if there's a element of misinformation around that. I did read as well that there were Brazilian forces also involved in very small numbers. I don't know where that came from. I don't know of any other evidence of where they were involved in the Second World War. Again, if someone can correct me with the comments, I'd be really keen to hear about that. But the size of the Polish corps in terms of soldier numbers actually grew within these final stages of the Second World War. And the reasons behind that were they actually got these additional soldiers from the Wehrmacht. So if you look at the historic Polish borders, particularly around 1939, on that western boundary where it borders with Germany, you get these places where they're basically German places in Poland, or culturally Polish places in Germany, the other way around. So the ones, or the Polish soldiers who were on the German border or over the German border, but they were culturally Polish, they were forced to fight for the Wehrmacht. And at the end of the war, they basically escaped from their roles within the German army and joined the Polish forces and played their part in saving Poland's status as a nation state. So, you know, really, really unique story from that perspective that doesn't always get articulated or isn't as well known as maybe it should be from that perspective as well. So I'm now about halfway down the Strada Maggiore. This is the main thoroughfare of which the Polish corps and the supporting allies entered the city. I did want to walk on the street to follow that historic path, but it's just not possible with the traffic. There's some really aggressive driving within this city with not much consideration for pedestrians, that's sort of fair to say. There's some wonderful imagery from that day of the Polish corps entering the city, the jubilation that you can see on the locals' faces, handing them wine, food, etc. in celebration of their arrival, liberating it from Nazi control. I have read a couple of interesting reports from the Polish perspective, and the Polish corps weren't as jubilant as you would think. A lot of them were very on edge on entering the city. It's a very medieval city, it's very dense. There was a suspicion that locals could be basically Nazis dressed up in local uniforms, etc., to disguise their appearance. They could have been quite easily been killed. So the Poles were very on edge from that perspective. They weren't as kind of jubilant as you would imagine. Equally as well, you've got to think about it from their perspective. They had just gone through 6 years of absolute turmoil, and particularly from a combat perspective, been involved in Monte Cassino, Ancona, and then finally 2 weeks of really aggressive fighting to overcome the Nazis in the final hour. So I can totally relate to how they weren't as jubilant as one would expect, particularly when you read those accounts and really kind of take into consideration what they would have gone through. A lot of them were probably really hungry, really tired, etc., and probably relieved that it was over. But the main thing was they were very on edge. There were still Nazis hiding around in the city. They were very vigilant as to whether Nazis were dressed up as locals and could have easily killed them on entering the city. So I'm just grabbing a coffee about halfway down the Strada Maggiore. I mean, it's a bloody awful road. It's quite quiet now, but there's just cars whizzing past. It's really unpleasant for pedestrians. But yeah, just trying to sort of savour the moment, really, and just kind of put myself in the Polish Second Corps shoes on that day in April 1945, knowing that they'd played an amazing part in overcoming, you know, one of the most dangerous and terrifying forces the world has ever seen, and it was very much going to be the beginning of the end now for the Second World War, and there was light at the end of the tunnel. And on that jubilant day, the 21st of April 1945, the Polish troops gathered in this city centre square right in the heart of Bologna, outside of the town hall. The Allied flags were raised on this building behind me. Any remaining troops, German troops within the city, were arrested and gathered here, and it was now the beginning of the end of the Second World War. Fighting continued over the coming days. The Allied forces were in the northern Lombardy plains within Italy, the Western Front, and of course in Berlin. And on the 8th of May 1945, the Second World War was finally over. Victory in Europe had arrived. So just outside the town hall, and we've got the Italian flag and the European Union flag flying at the moment. But you can just imagine on that valiant day, the British, the American, and of course the Polish flags flying proudly from this building. I have seen some documents in the exhibition that I saw the other day, and read other accounts that the captured Nazis, the remaining Nazis who were in the within the city boundaries, were gathered here, and it was quite challenging to keep the Polish army away from them. A lot of them just wanted to kill them, basically, to put it bluntly. These were the enemy. These were the people who had savaged and attempted to destroy our culture, our nation, and many members of their families in a lot of instances. So it was quite difficult to keep some of the Polish soldiers away from killing those Nazis. And I know the Allies, the British and the Americans, had quite a challenging job in terms of keeping them away. But nonetheless, you can just imagine the celebrations that day. I mean, it's an amazing setting, and how proud, but at the same time, that kind of sense of purpose for the Polish corps was still a little bit up in the air. The war was going to be over, but they still didn't have a homeland to go to, and what followed next was still going to be a mystery. So within the town hall square, I've just been admiring this immense building, but I think kind of more importantly for the context of this video is these two plaques on the wall, basically commemorating the Polish soldiers, commemorating the Polish liberation of Bologna on that day back in April of 1945, 21st of April 1945, and clearly celebrating the 80th anniversary with the date on the bottom right hand corner. And it just shows the kind of significance of what my grandfather and his colleagues achieved in the liberation of this city, setting that framework for the beginning of the end of the Second World War. It's quite incredible. Just like that, after 6 long and brutal years, the war was finally over, but for the Polish corps, their future remained uncertain. As a consequence of the Yalta Agreement, the borders had changed in Poland, and it was now, particularly in those ancient eastern provinces where the corps came from, was now the Soviet Union. If they'd have returned to Poland at this point, they would have been persecuted, tortured, and potentially executed. It simply wasn't an option. Throughout the remainder of 1945 and into 1946, the corps stayed in various settlement camps in and around Italy. Once Churchill, in 1946, had realised, as a consequence of his actions and decision-makings within the Yalta Agreement, he established a new policy to allow the Polish corps to settle in England. Into 1946, from July to December, thousands made the journey through the Mediterranean, up to the English Channel, and either to Glasgow or to Liverpool. And in the context of my granddad, he arrived in England in 1946 in Liverpool. He settled in one of the Polish resettlement camps in Barnsley, stayed there, learned English, probably learned local trades, and then was let out into society and met my grandmother, and the rest is history. But for now, on VED, this 80th anniversary, I'm here to enjoy the moment, see it in context, the finale of what those great men went through. So in that old school fashion, I've done what they probably would have done on that day in 1945, found a local bar to drink some beer and to simply say, na zdrowie.